Silas Vaughn thought he was buying a quiet hunting cabin for a single silver dollar until he found a red-haired girl chained to the hearth. In that moment, the cabin became a battleground, and Silas discovered a purpose harder than the mountain stones, freeing Ember and keeping her free. He paid a dollar for a forgotten shack in the woods, expecting only dust and rot. But inside, he found a girl who hadn't spoken in 3 years, and neither of their lives would ever be the same. The door creaked before he even touched it, the warped wood groaning like it hadn't been opened in years. Silas Grant hesitated, hand hovering near the rusted latch, his breath clouding in the morning chill. He hadn't expected much when he signed the papers in Toner Shack for a single dollar, a place so far off the trail no one bothered to claim it. To him, it was just land a start, something to put between himself and the memories he was trying to leave behind. But as the door sagged open, a sour draft rushed out, and his gut told him something wasn't right. The shack was small, one room, a cot in the corner, a broken table and dust piled high enough to write in. A collapsed shelf leaned against the wall, half buried under rotted books. A single cracked window let in a dull gray light. But there was something else. A sound so faint he thought at first it was the wind. Then he heard it again. A scrape, then a shuffle from behind the doorframe near the hearth. As stiffened. He'd been alone for too long to ignore instincts like that. "Hello?" he called softly, his voice startlingly loud in the empty cabin. No answer. He stepped inside, boots crunching over glass and grit. Every sense screamed at him that the place wasn't empty, that he wasn't alone. Then he saw her, a girl no older than 14, hair tangled and matted, her dress hanging loose from her thin frame. She crouched in the farthest corner like a frightened animal, knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't speak, didn't move. Silas froze where he stood. "It's all right," he said quietly, palms open, careful not to step closer. "I'm not here to hurt you." Still nothing. She just stared at him, so still it was like she barely breathed. Her lips were chapped and bloodied, her skin pale beneath layers of grime. But her eyes were alive, sharp and frightened, as though every muscle in her body was coiled to run. Silas crouched, slowly lowering himself to her level. "My name's Silas," he tried again, voice calm, steady. "This place, it's mine now, but I didn't know anyone was living here. Nothing." The silence pressed in thick and suffocating. He took a small step closer, and that was when he saw it. A chain, rusted, bolted into the floor, fastened around her ankle. The sight hit him like a blow. Whoever she was, she hadn't just been hiding. She'd been kept here. His jaw tightened. "Who did this to you?" The girl flinched at his voice, curling tighter against the wall. Not a word, not a sound, just raw fear in her eyes. By the time he fetched his tools from the cart outside, his hands were shaking. The lock was old, stubborn, but it gave way with a loud snap. The girl didn't move. Even as the shackle clattered to the floor, she just stared at him, eyes wide, as though freedom was too foreign to trust. "You're not staying here," Silas muttered under his breath. She didn't fight him when he lifted her, though her body was stiff, tense as a drawn boring. She weighed almost nothing beneath his coat bones, sharp under thin skin. Outside, the forest loomed in every direction, pines creaking in the wind, branches heavy with snow that slid down in wet clumps. He carried her to the cart, setting her gently on a folded blanket. She didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on something far away, maybe something only she could see. "Do you have a name?" Silas asked softly as he climbed up beside her. No reply. "All right," he murmured. "We'll figure it out." The horse shifted, impatient, and Silas flicked the rez. The cart jolted forward, wheels crunching through packed snow. The forest road wound narrow and uneven, shadows long even in mid-daylight. Every so often, Silas glanced sideways at her, wondering what kind of hell she'd lived through to end up chained in that place. She didn't blink much, didn't react when the horse stumbled or when branches scraped the sides of the cart. She sat too still, her fingers curled tight in her lap, knuckles pale. Silas tried not to speak too much, sensing that words wouldn't reach her yet, but his thoughts ran loud in his head. Someone had left her very locked away, forgotten, and people didn't do that without reason. Halfway down the trail, he thought he heard something, a crack of a branch behind them. He slowed, the horse eyes scanning the treeline, but nothing moved, just the whisper of wind through pines. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was near. By the time the cabin came into view, a modest place he borrowed until he could build his own. Light was already dimming. Silas lifted her down from the cart, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. She stood frozen on the ground as though the weight of the world held her ankles. Inside, he lit the lamp, the warm glow pushing back the gloom. He poured water from the kettle and set bread on the table, trying to make it all look as normal as he could. "You should eat," he said gently. The girl didn't move. Silas sat across from her, giving her space. For a long time, the only sound was the faint hiss of the fire. She reached for the bread at last, but only after glancing at him like she was expecting to be struck for it. His chest tightened at the sight. That night, Silas lay awake on the cot while she curled in the corner with the blanket pulled high. Every creak of the forest outside made him tense. Whoever had kept her in that shack, he doubted they'd just forget about her. As sleep began to pull at him, a soft sound broke the stillness. Not a word, not speech, just a quiet broken sob. It was the first sound she'd made all day. Silas stared at the ceiling, fists clenched. Whoever had done this, whoever had stolen her voice, her trust was still out there. And somehow he knew this wasn't over. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that couldn't quite decide if it belonged to night or day. Silas rose quietly, careful not to wake the girl, though she hadn't moved much at all since she'd settled in the corner. She hadn't stirred when he added wood to the fire or when the kettle hissed softly on the stove. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her eyes closed tight as if sleep was the only safe place she had left. Silas stepped outside, boots crunching in the thin crust of snow, and drew in the cold air until it stung his lungs. His mind wouldn't stop circling back to the shack, to the chain bolted into the floor, to the hollow look in the girl's eyes. He'd seen pain before, seen loss, but this was something different. This was someone emptied out, left behind so long she'd forgotten how to speak. He gathered water from the well and fed the horse, working through the motions that had always given his hands something to do, while his thoughts tangled themselves into knots. When he finally returned inside, she was awake, sitting in the same place, knees hugged to her chest, staring at the fire. She didn't flinch when he entered, didn't look away, just watched the flames as if they were the only thing in the world still moving. "Morning," Silas said softly, setting down the bucket. She didn't reply, of course. He poured water into the kettle and sliced a bit of bread, laying it on the table with quiet deliberation. He knew better than to push. Some wounds had to be coaxed, not forced. He sat at the table, keeping his distance, but let the silence stretch, not as something heavy, but as something patient. After a while, her eyes shifted toward the bread. "It's for you," he murmured, not meeting her gaze directly. Her hands moved hesitantly, trembling as she reached for it. She broke off a piece, then another, eating as though she'd forgotten what it felt like to be full. Watching her made Silas's stomach knot in anger at whoever had left her like this, whoever had starved her of more than just food. When they'd eaten, Silas crouched a little ways off, pulling a small whittling knife from his pocket. He began to carve a scrap of wood, letting the soft scrape of the blade fill the quiet. After a while, he held out the beginnings of a bird, its shape just barely taking form. "You like it?" he asked, his tone casual. Her eyes flicked to the piece, then back to the fire. No answer. "That's all right," Silas said after a moment. "Takes time." He set the carving down where she could see it and rose to his feet. By midday, the forest had warmed just enough for snow to drip from the branches in uneven rhythms. Silas took the horse to fetch supplies from town. He debated leaving her alone, but he couldn't bring himself to lock the door from the outside. It felt too much like the thing he'd freed her from. Instead, he stacked kindling by the hearth and left water within reach. "Won't be long," he said gently before stepping out. The ride to town was uneventful, but the pit in his stomach never eased. He bought bread, dried beans, some cloth, and an extra blanket. As he walked through the mercantile, he caught himself wondering if anyone had noticed the girl, if anyone in this town had heard about a child gone missing. But when he asked the storekeeper, the man only shrugged. "Plenty of folks out there minding their own business," the man said. "Woods will swallow you whole if you let it. People disappear." The words stayed with Silas the whole way back. When he returned, she was where he'd left her, but her eyes moved this time, following him as he stepped inside. It was the smallest thing, but it felt like the first crack in the wall she'd built around herself. "I brought you something," Silas said, holding out the folded blanket. She stared at it for a long moment before taking it, clutching it tightly to her chest, like she didn't know if she was allowed to keep it. That night, as the fire burned low, Silas sat on the cot, the knife in his hand, working slowly at the carving. The bird was beginning to look like a bird, now wings curved just slightly as though ready to take flight. "You should have a name," he said quietly. "Can't keep calling you girl." Her eyes lifted just slightly before darting back to the fire. He smiled faintly to himself. "Maybe tomorrow you can tell me." The following days found a rhythm. Silas chopped wood and fetched water, while she sat quietly inside, never speaking. Rarely moving, but she ate when he set food out. And sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she studied the carving that now sat on the table. One morning, Silas left the knife and another scrap of wood by her blanket. He didn't say a word about it, just set them down and stepped outside to split logs. When he came back, the wood was still untouched, but the knife had been shifted an inch, as if she'd reached for it and stopped herself. It was late afternoon when it happened. A sound, sharp, distant, deliberate taco from the trees. Silas froze the axe still in his hands. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was the heavy crack of a branch stepped on by someone who didn't care about being heard. He scanned the tree, iron heart hammering. Another crack closer. Inside, the girl sat frozen, her wide eyes staring at the door, as if she knew exactly what that sound meant. Silas set the axe down carefully, his gaze never leaving the trees. Whoever had left her chained in that shack hadn't disappeared, and now they were here. Silas stayed perfectly still, one hand on the rough haft of the axe. The forest, usually restless with wind and bird calls, had gone quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Snow dripped from the branches in slow measured beats, but beneath that soft rhythm he could hear it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, getting closer. The girl hadn't moved. She sat curled in her corner, her eyes wide and fixed on the door. Her hands twisted in the blanket he'd given her, fingers knotting the fabric so tightly her knuckles were white. She wasn't just scared, she knew. Whoever was coming, she recognized the sound of them. Silas took a slow step backward toward the cabin. He didn't want to leave her unguarded, but he needed to see. The axe felt solid in his grip, but it wasn't much comfort. A man with a weapon was still just one man. He crouched low and peered through the trees. At first there was nothing, just pines and shadows. Then a figure broke through the brush. A man, broad in the shoulders, coat lined with fur too fine for someone living off the land. He carried himself with a kind of confidence that didn't come from strength, but from owning whatever was in front of him. Another man followed behind, leaner, wiry, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The third lagged a few paces back, leading two horses burdened with packs. The first man removed his gloves, slowly flexing his fingers like he owned the place already. His eyes swept over the clearing, then settled on the cabin. "Thought we'd find you here," he said, voice smooth and practiced. Silas didn't answer. He stepped out just enough to make himself seen, but kept the axe in hand. The man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've got something of mine." Silas didn't move. "You left a chained girl in a shack. Doesn't make her yours." The man tilted his head as though Silas had said something quaint. "She's worth more than you could imagine. You think you're saving her, stranger, but you're not. You're meddling." The girl's muffled breath reached Silas even from inside. He could hear her panic. Small, sharp gasps. She couldn't hold back. "You're not taking her," Silas said flatly. The second man laughed under his breath, adjusting the rifle strap on his shoulder. "This fell's got a death wish." The first man didn't look at his companion. His gaze stayed locked on Silas. "You paid $1 for that shack. Thought you'd found a bargain, but some things out here aren't for you to keep. You let her walk away with you. You'll find out real quick just how long you last." Silas tightened his grip on the axe but stayed silent. The man sighed as though disappointed. "Suit yourself, but if she's not at that shack by sundown, we'll come take her back, and when we do, you won't be breathing to stop us." He turned to leave, motioning for the others to follow. They didn't hurry. They moved like men who believed the land belonged to them, who thought threats didn't need to be repeated. Silas waited until they disappeared into the trees before stepping back into the cabin. The girl hadn't moved. She still sat with her knees hugged tight, but her eyes were locked on him now, pleading and terrified, as if she expected him to walk out and hand her over. "You're not going back," Silas said firmly. She flinched at his tone, but she didn't look away. The rest of the day passed like a noose tightening around both their necks. Silas checked the rifle above the haft, loaded it, and set it near the door. He wasn't a man who reached for guns first, but he wasn't about to let her be taken again. Outside, he chopped wood as if he could split the anger out of himself, but his ears stayed sharp, straining for any sound out of place. Every crack of the forest set his nerves on edge. The girl hadn't touched the food he left out at midday. She just sat with the blanket wrapped, tight eyes darting to the window every few moments. Silas knelt beside her as the light began to fade. "They might come tonight," he said quietly, "but you're safe with me. I won't let them take you." Her lips parted just slightly as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came. Night fell heavy, the forest turning to a sea of black and silver under the moon. Silas kept the fire low, knowing bright light would make them a target. The rifle rested across his knees as he sat in the corner nearest the door listening. For hours there was nothing. Then a branch cracked outside. Silas's head snapped up. Another crack closer. The girl's hand crept across the floor until her fingers brushed his boot, her grip trembling but desperate. Silas didn't move. He waited. The door handle shifted just slightly, and then the night exploded. Hoof beats, pounding voices, shouting the unmistakable thud of boots hitting the ground. They'd come back, and this time they weren't leaving without a fight. The handle rattled harder, the wood groaning under a rough shove. Silas rose slowly, rifle steady in his hands. His breath came out in short, controlled bursts, every sense straining to track the shadows outside the window. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," a voice called from beyond the door, smooth, mocking, the same voice as before. Silas didn't answer. "You think she's yours to save. You don't even know what she is." The voice continued as if talking long enough would wear him down. "Open the door, Grant. Walk away and we'll forget this ever happened." The girl had curled into herself against the wall. Blanket clutched so tightly it looked like she'd tear it apart. Her eyes darted between Silas and the door, wide and shining, pleading without words. Another shove against the door made the frame shake. Silas aimed at the spot just above the latch and spoke for the first time. "Step away!" A laugh came in response, sharp, humorless. "You've got no idea what you're meddling in." Then the next sound wasn't laughter. It was the splintering crack of a boot slamming into the door. The door burst inward on the third kick, wood splitting near the hinges. Silas fired before the first man could clear the threshold. The blast roared through the cabin, and the man staggered back, not hit, but startled enough to lose his footing on the icy ground. The second man swung his rifle up, but Silas was faster, racking another round and aiming square. "Don't!" Silas growled. The rifleman froze, hands raised halfway in mock surrender. Behind them, the third mansulent, broad face, hard as stone, moved forward, a knife glinting at his hip. His eyes didn't leave the girl. Something in Silas's chest burned hot at that look. "Drop it!" Silas ordered, voice low and cutting. The man didn't move. For a long, taut moment, no one breathed. Then slowly the knife was lowered, but none of them stepped back. "You think you can just keep her?" the first man said, straightening, brushing snow from his coat, as if the gun aimed at him didn't matter. "She's not some lost lamb you get to rescue. She belongs to people who understand her value. She belongs to herself." Elliot shot back. The man smiled, cold and thin. "Keep telling yourself that, but we'll be back, and next time you'll wish you'd listen." One by one they stepped away, melting into the dark trees. Silas held the rifle steady until the last shadow vanished into the night. When the door was barred again, Silas finally turned. The girl still hadn't moved, her breathing sharp and uneven. "They won't stop," Silas said quietly, crouching to meet her gaze. "But I won't let them take you." Her eyes locked on his. For the first time she looked less like someone hollowed out and more like someone trying to believe him. The next morning brought no sense of relief. Silas patched the splintered door with what little wood he had, knowing it was only a temporary fix. Every sound outside, the groan of trees in the wind, the snap of a branch, set his nerves on edge. He tried to distract her, leaving the small knife and a piece of soft wood on the table again. When he returned from splitting logs, the wood had been shaved down unevenly, clumsy lines cut into its surface. She hadn't looked at him while doing it, but she'd tried. It was the first sign she might want more than silence. Later, as dust settled again, Silas noticed her watching the window. He followed her gaze. Tracks, deep ones, half filled with snow. Someone had been close watching. Silas gripped the rifle tighter. They were waiting for something. He knelt beside her. "You've got to trust me," he said softly. For a long moment she just stared at him. Then almost imperceptibly she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was enough to know when they came back and he wouldn't be fighting for her alone. The wind rose that night, moaning low through the trees as if the forest itself warned them to stay alert. Silas barely slept the rifle across his lap while he sat slumped against the wall. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the fire kept his eyes half open. The girl didn't sleep either. She lay curled under the blanket, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the embers, always watching the door. The tension in her small frame never eased, not even when hours passed without another sound outside. By dawn, Silas was on his feet again, muscles aching from stillness. He stepped outside into a brittle gray light, the cold biting deeper than usual. The tracks from the night before had iced over frozen proof that someone had been close enough to touch the cabin walls. Silas chopped wood until his shoulders burned, partly for the stove, partly to bleed out the restless anger building inside him. Someone out there thought they could own her chain, take her back whenever they pleased. When he returned inside, she was still in the corner blanket pulled high around her thin shoulders, but her eyes shifted briefly to the table where the carving knife still lay beside a scrap of wood. "You can try again," Silas said softly, setting another piece of wood down near her. For a long moment she didn't move. Then her small pale fingers reached out. She held the knife awkwardly, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed the blade to the wood. Silas didn't speak. He busied himself with sweeping the floor, letting her find her own way without the weight of his eyes. The faint scrape of the blade against wood filled the silence, uneven but deliberate. That afternoon, Silas took her outside for the first time. She hesitated at the threshold, her bare feet rooted to the floorboards as though the outside world was too big, too dangerous. "It's safe," Silas said gently. She stepped out slowly, her eyes darting in every direction. The open space seemed to overwhelm her. The trees stretching tall, the crunch of snow underfoot, the wide, endless sky. She stood still for a long time, the cold nipping at her toes, her expression unreadable. But then her gaze shifted downward. She crouched suddenly, scooping up a handful of snow. She turned it over in her hands, almost curious, before letting it crumble away. Silas watched a faint ache tightening in his chest. For all the fear she carried, there was still something in Hersam's small part that hadn't been completely stolen away. When they returned to the cabin, she placed the wood carving on the table. It wasn't much, just a rough block with uneven cuts, but it was hers. "Good," Silas said, simply nodding toward it. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away from him either. The peace didn't last. That night, as the fire burned low, Silas heard it again. The sound of something heavy brushing against the outside wall. Not an animal too deliberate. He motioned for her to stay quiet, though she was already frozen in place, eyes wide. He grabbed the rifle and eased to the door, heart pounding in his throat. Through the sliver of the window, he saw them. 3 men again, this time closer. One of them crouched by the corner of the cabin, as though studying the wall. Another leaned casually against a tree, smoking. The leader stood in the open hands behind his back face, calm as if he had all the time in the world. Silas's stomach twisted. They weren't leaving this time. "You've got until morning." The man's voice cut through the night, carrying too easily on the still air. "Put her outside and you walk away. No blood, no fuss." Silence stretched. "Don't," the man said finally, his tone almost amused. "And we take her and you watch." He turned and walked back into the trees like he was certain of the outcome. Silas stood at the window long after they were gone, his jaw tight. The girl had crept closer, her fingers clutching at the hem of his coat. "They won't stop," Silas murmured. She didn't speak, but this time her small hand stayed on his coat, holding on like she refused to let go. Silas stared at the fire until the embers dimmed to a dull red glow. If they came at dawn, there would be no more warnings. And for the first time since he found her, he wondered if he could keep his promise. The night stretched on endlessly, every sound amplified by the tension wound tight in Silas's chest. The girl didn't sleep. She sat curled up with the blanket wrapped around her eyes, fixed on the dim glow of the embers. Outside, the wind rattled the trees, but beneath it, Silas thought he heard the faint shift of snow footsteps, maybe pacing just out of sight. When the first trace of dawn touched the treetops, Silas was already on his feet. He stoked the fire just enough for warmth, then quietly checked the rifle again. The girl followed his movements silently, her eyes wide but steady. She wasn't trembling this time. Silas crouched beside her. "They'll come today," he said softly, "but you're not going with them. Understand?" She stared at him for a long moment before giving the smallest nod. It wasn't much, but it was something. The morning was painfully still. Silas split wood by the side of the cabin, partly to look busy, partly so he wouldn't have to sit and wait for the inevitable. The girl stayed inside, but every so often he caught her peering out the window, as if bracing herself for whatever was coming. By late morning, the sound of hooves shattered the quiet. Silas dropped the axe and grabbed the rifle from the porch. 3 riders again, same men, same confident postures. They stopped just beyond the clearing, their horses snorting clouds into the cold air. The leader dismounted first, brushing snow from his coat like he was preparing for a casual conversation. "Morning, Grant," he called. "We've been patient. You've had your chance." Silas stepped forward a few paces, rifle leveled. "You come any closer, you won't be walking away." The leader chuckled. "You think you're the first man who's tried to stand in our way? She's worth more than you understand. She's mine." The word made Silas's grip tighten. "She's no one's." The second man slid off his horse rifle in hand. "We can end this clean or we can end it messy. Your choice." Silas took another step forward, planting himself between them and the cabin door. "You'll have to go through me first." For a moment, no one moved. Then the leader's smile faded. "Fine. Have it your way." The next moments blurred. The rifleman raised his weapon, but Silas fired first. The shot cracked through the still morning, and the man stumbled back, dropping his rifle into the snow. The horses spooked, tossing their heads and stamping nervously. The leader lunged forward, drawing a pistol from his coat. Silas ducked behind a tree, another shot ringing out as splinters exploded from the trunk near his shoulder. Inside the cabin, the girl crouched low, her hands pressed to her ears. But through the cracks of the door, she could see Silas, outnumbered, outgunned, refusing to move back. The silent man, the third one with the knife, moved fast, circling toward the cabin. Silas saw him just in time. He swung the rifle like a club, catching the man in the shoulder and knocking him off balance. But the leader took the opening. A shot rang out, grazing Silas's arm and spinning him halfway around. Pain seared through him, but he stayed on his feet, forcing himself to raise the rifle again. "Last chance, Grant!" The leader shouted, his voice sharp with fury. "Now step aside!" Silas spat into the snow. "Not happening!" The leader's eyes narrowed. "Then you die for nothing." He raised the pistol and the door to the cabin swung open. The girl stood there barefoot in the snow blankets slipping from her shoulders. Her small hands trembled, but her eyes, so hollow for so long, were blazing with something new. "Stop." The word tore from her throat, raw and broken, but loud enough to freeze every man where he stood. It was the first sound she had made in 3 years, and for a single stunned heartbeat, even the forest went silent. The men froze. The leader's pistol stayed raised, but his eyes widened just slightly at the sound of her voice. It wasn't much, just one hoarse, desperate word, but it cut through the clearing sharper than any bullet. The girl's chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. Her lips trembled, but her eyes stayed fixed on the man in the fine coat. You don't own me," she said, the words uneven, almost like she'd forgotten how to shape them. The leader blinked momentarily, caught off guard. Then his lips curved into a cold, cruel smile. "You think saying it makes it true? You were mine long before this man found you." Silas stepped in front of her, rifle leveled. "She's not yours, not anymore." The leader's eyes shifted between them, weighing his next move. "You can't protect her forever. Men like you always think they're saviors, always end up in the ground." Silas didn't lower his weapon. "Try me." The standoff stretched long and taut, the cold air thick with the weight of everything unsaid. The other 2 men hovered, tense but uncertain, their confidence shaken by the girl's sudden defiance. "Take her," the leader snapped, finally stepping to the side. The silent man with the knife lunged forward. Silas fired. The shot cracked through the clearing, echoing off the trees. The knife clattered into the snow as the man collapsed with a cry, clutching his shoulder. The rifleman, already wounded from before, swore under his breath and took a step back, his hands half raised. The leader stared at Silas, fury twisting his features. "You've made a mistake you can't take back." "Maybe," Silas said, his voice steady, "but you're leaving now." For a long moment it seemed the man might shoot anyway. His finger tightened on the trigger. The barrel aimed square at Silas's chest. But then the girl stepped close, not behind Silas this time, but beside him. Her small hand brushed his coat, gripping the fabric like an anchor. The leader's gaze flicked to her, something dark and calculating in his eyes. "This isn't over," he spat. Then he turned sharply, mounting his horse in one fluid motion. The other man scrambled up behind him, clutching his wounded arm. The three of them disappeared into the trees, their retreating hoof-beats fading until only the wind remained. Silas lowered the rifle slowly, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack his ribs. The girl didn't let go of his coat. "You spoke," he said softly, almost in disbelief. She nodded, her throat working as if she had to remember how to swallow. "I didn't know if I could." Silas knelt to meet her eyes. "You can, and you don't have to stop now." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. They can't take me back. Not while I'm here," Silas said. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I patched his arm as best he could, though the wound wasn't deep enough to stop him working. The girl stayed close, always within reach, like she still wasn't convinced he'd remain if she looked away. By evening, she had spoken again, small words halting in broken water. "Fire. Thank you." Each one was like testing new ground, shaky but stronger than the last. When night came, she sat beside him near the hearth instead of in her usual corner. She held the rough carving she'd made earlier that day, turning it in her hands like it was proof she was real, that this moment was real. Silas leaned back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at him, but his eyes stayed on the fire. He knew this wasn't over. The men would come back, maybe tomorrow, maybe in a week. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was standing alone, because the girl, silent for 3 long years, had finally found her voice. And that voice had just made her more dangerous to them than any gun ever could. The night passed in a fragile kind of calm, like a thread stretched too thin and ready to snap. Silas slept in fits, always waking at the slightest sound. The shifting of the cabin walls, the wind brushing through the trees, the faint creak of the girl moving beneath her blanket. By dawn, she was awake before him. She sat at the table, the crude carving clasped in her hands, her gaze fixed on the doorway. Her shoulders weren't shaking anymore. She looked steady, different from the childlike figure who had cowed in silence days before. Silas rose slowly, his injured arms stiff but functional. "You slept?" he asked. She nodded a little. The words were soft but clearer than before. "Good." Silas poured water into a tin cup and set it in front of her. She murmured a quiet thanks, voice still rough but less uncertain. The forest outside was quiet, but Silas knew better than to trust quiet. The men would not accept defeat. They had left too easily, and men like that never walked away without plans to return. Silas began reinforcing the cabin, moving furniture against the weakest points of the walls, setting up crude barricades near the windows. The girl watched him, silent at first, then finally asked, "They'll come back?" "Yes." Silas didn't soften the truth. She set down the carving, her small hands balling into fists. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." Silas looked at her, a mix of pride and sorrow tightening his chest. "Then we get ready together." The rest of the morning became a quiet flurry of preparation. Silas showed her how to gather the driest wood for the fire, how to set water to boil without letting the flames grow too bright at night. He even let her touch the rifle, not to fire it, just to understand how it worked. Her small fingers trembled as she traced the cool metal. "It's heavy," she whispered. "It's supposed to be," Silas said. "Weapons should feel heavy. Makes you remember what they're for." She nodded solemnly, setting it back down. As the day wore on, a tension settled in the air that neither of them could ignore. The girl spoke more now, short words, halting sentences, but every time her voice cracked, it made Silas want to find the men who had broken her and make them pay. "You had a name," Silas said softly that afternoon, as they sat near the hearth while snow fell in the distance. She hesitated, her lips parting, as if the question reached into a place she hadn't dared to touch in years. Finally, she whispered, "Ember." Silas repeated it under his breath. "Ember." She looked up at him like she wasn't sure she'd done the right thing in telling him. "It's yours," Silas said firmly. "Don't let them take that from you again." Something shifted in her eyes, then something stronger, almost defiant. By dusk, the wind carried a new sound. Hoof beatats. Silas was already at the window before the girl Ember could speak. 5 riders this time, not 3. They were done threatening. The leader sat tall in the saddle, face grim and cold now. No pretense of charm remained. "This is your last chance," he called, his voice slicing through the brittle evening air. Silas stepped out, rifle in hand, positioning himself in the center of the clearing. "You've had yours." The leader's jaw tightened. "Then you both die tonight," he signaled with his hand. The men dismounted, spreading out in a half circle. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was the beginning. Silas braced himself. Behind him, Ember stepped to the doorway. No blanket, no fear in her stance now. Just a quiet resolve that made her look older than her years. She said nothing, but her presence at his back said everything. The fight wasn't over. But this time Silas knew whatever happened, she wouldn't face it as the silent, broken girl they had once left in chains. The clearing was dead silent except for the faint shifting of horses and the crunch of boots in the snow. Silas stood in the open, rifle raised, every muscle coiled tight. Ember hovered just inside the doorway, her small hands gripping the frame, her eyes locked on the men spreading out like wolves closing in on a wounded prey. "You think you can win?" the leader sneered, drawing his pistol. "You're outnumbered, Grant. You've got one shot before we put you in the ground." Az didn't answer. He angled slightly, keeping Ember out of their direct line of fire. His injured arm throbbed, but he ignored it. The leader nodded to one of his men, and the first shot rang out, sharp, deafening, splintering bark from the tree beside Silas. He dropped to one knee, fired back, and one of the riders cried out, spinning into the snow, clutching his leg. Chaos broke loose. The silent man with the knife charged again, weaving low to the ground, eyes fixed on the cabin door. Silas swung the rifle like a club, slamming the stock into the man's jaw. The man collapsed but tried to scramble to his feet, knife flashing in the dim light. "Stay back, Ember," Silas barked. But Ember didn't run. Instead, she grabbed the heavy pan from beside the hearth and stepped forward, her small frame shaking, but not with fear. As the knife-wielding man lunged again, she swung with everything she had. The pan connected with a sickening crack. The man crumpled face first into the snow, motionless. The 2 remaining riders hesitated, clearly rattled, but the leader's fury kept them from retreating. He advanced with his pistol raised, firing once, twice each shot, barely missing Silas as he rolled behind a fallen log for cover. "You can't keep her, Grant," the leader shouted. "You don't know what she is. She'll ruin you just like she ruined everyone before you." Ember flinched at the words, but her jaw set hard, her grip on the pan, white-knuckled. "She isn't yours," Silas roared back. "Not now, not ever." The leader moved closer, too confident, too sure of himself. Silas waited, heart-pounding, fingers steadied, and fired. The leader stumbled back with a guttural sound, his pistol falling from his hand. He collapsed to his knees, glaring at Silas with venom, even as blood spread across his coat. "You think this ends with me," he rasped. "You've just made her more valuable. They'll never stop coming." Silas advanced slowly, rifle still leveled. "Let them come. She's not theirs anymore." The man's glare faltered just slightly before his body sagged, strength leaving him. The last 2 riders bolted. They didn't look back as they mounted their horses and vanished into the trees, leaving only the groans of the wounded man in the snow. For a long moment, Silas didn't move. His breath came fast, clouding in the cold air. Ember stepped out slowly, her bare feet sinking into the snow. She looked at the fallen leader, then at Silas. "He's gone," she whispered. Silas nodded. "For now." They dragged the wounded man to the edge of the clearing and tied his hands, leaving him with enough supplies to survive if he chose to walk away. Silas doubted he'd ever come back. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Silas leaned the rifle against the wall and sat heavily at the table. His arm throbbed, his whole body sore from the fight. Ember sat across from him, still clutching the pan, her breathing uneven. "You saved us," Silas said softly. She shook her head. "You did." "No," I said firmly. "You fought back. That's yours. No one can take that away from you again." That night, for the first time since he'd found her, Ember didn't sit curled in the corner. She sat beside him at the hearth, close enough that their shoulders touched. She whispered her name once more, like she was claiming it out loud. Ember. I smiled faintly, the tension in his chest loosening just a little. Ember. But as the flames flickered low, Silas knew the man's last words weren't an empty threat. Others would come, and if they wanted to take her, they'd have to go through him first. The weeks after the fight passed with a strange mix of quiet and unease. Winter still held the land in its grip, but the air felt different, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Az kept busy splitting wood, repairing the damage to the cabin, hunting when he could. He moved with a constant awareness, now his rifle never far from reach, eyes always scanning the treine. The memory of the leader's last words lingered in his mind like a thorn. They'll never stop coming. Ember never left his side. She was different now, not the silent shadow he had first found in the corner of that shack. She spoke more each day, her voice halting at times, but growing stronger, steadier. There was a stubborn fire in her now, one that seemed to grow every time she used her own name. "You really paid only $1 for this place?" she asked one morning as they stacked freshly cut wood near the hearth. "Yep, best dollar I ever spent," Silas replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Why?" Ember asked softly. "Why would you come all the way out here all alone?" Silas set the log down, leaning against the wall for a moment. "Because I thought I was done with people. Thought the world had nothing left for me, and I had nothing left for it. This cabin felt like a place where no one could find me, where I could just vanish." Ember studied him, her small brow furrowed. "But you didn't vanish." "No," Silas admitted, meeting her eyes. "And I'm glad for it." As the days passed, they built a rhythm. Silas taught her simple things: show to start a fire, how to tell when the river ice was too thin to walk on, how to hold a hatchet without hurting herself. Ember soaked it all in. For years she had been told what to do, never asked to think for herself. Now with every new thing she learned, she seemed to grow a little taller, her shoulders a little straighter. One afternoon, Silas found her outside with one of his knives, carefully whittling at a piece of scrap wood. "What are you making?" he asked. She shrugged but smiled faintly. "I don't know yet." He left her to it. By nightfall, she presented him with a rough carving of a bird, its wings uneven but unmistakably poised, as if ready to take flight. "For you," she said quietly, holding it out. Silas turned it in his hands, running his thumb over the groove she had made. "It's good," he said. Her smile widened. "You taught me to try." The peace didn't last forever. 2 weeks after the fight, riders came again, but this time they were different. 6 of them wearing badges. They rode slowly into the clearing, cautious but not hostile. Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but lowered. Ember hovered just behind him, close enough that he could feel her presence. The sheriff dismounted, first a grizzled man with tired eyes. "Silas Grant." Silas nodded once. "We heard about Beaumont Crow, heard what he was doing to the children he took." At the mention of the name, Ember's small fingers twisted in the back of Silas's coat, but she didn't hide. The sheriff's eyes softened when they landed on her. "You did right putting him in the ground. There's wanted posters for him 3 towns over. You won't see trouble from us." Silas exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders. The sheriff gestured to his men, who unloaded supplies, flour beans, salt, coffee, things Silas hadn't had in months. "It's not payment," the sheriff said. "It's what's owed. He took from this land for too long." When they rode away, they left the clearing, quiet again, the echo of hooves fading into the trees. That night, Ember sat near the fire, carving again. Her hands were steadier now, her strokes more confident. The shape was clearer this time, an eagle with wings spread wide. She held it out to him once more. "For you," Silas smiled as he took it. "And for you, you're stronger than you know, Ember." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." "You don't have to be," Silas said. "Not as long as you remember who you are." Spring came slowly, melting the snow in patches, softening the ground beneath their boots. Silas started clearing land for a garden. Ember worked beside him, her laughter soft but real when the mud splashed her skirt. The past wasn't gone. Some nights she still woke from nightmares, her voice trapped in her throat. But each time Silas sat with her until she found her words again. And every time she came back faster. One evening, as the sun dipped low and golden over the pines, Ember stood with her chin raised, watching the light fade. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said quietly, almost to herself. Silas looked at her, and for the first time since he'd found her, he believed it. He had paid $1 for a shack in the woods, but what he found inside a girl who had once been silent and now spoke her name with pride was worth more than anything he had ever thought he deserved. As the last light of day bathed the cabin in gold, Ember's voice rang out clear, steady, alive, and Silas knew with absolute certainty that no one would ever take it from her again. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, melting the snow in uneven patches, letting small buds push through the frost-bitten earth. The river thawed slowly, its frozen surface breaking apart into jagged sheets that floated downstream. With the change in the air came something else too. Something Silas hadn't felt in years: possibility. The cabin had once been just a shelter, a place to vanish from the world, but now it was something more. Silas began clearing the land around it, cutting back the brush that had grown wild. Ember worked beside him every day, her cheeks flushed pink from the chill in the sun. She laughed when the mud splashed her boots, her once soft voice now carrying freely through the clearing. Silas had not realized how much he had needed that sound until he heard it. "You're better at this than I expected," he teased as she dropped another armful of sticks beside the fire pit. "I've had a good teacher," she said, simply brushing stray hair from her face. They spent their mornings working, hauling stones from the earth to line a small garden, mending the cabin roof before the spring rains came. In the afternoons, Ember carved or sat by the river, her feet dangling in the frigid water, watching the current sweep away the last of the ice. Some evenings she asked questions about the world beyond the forest, what towns were like, what cities looked like, what it meant to ride a train or see the ocean. Silas answered as best as he could, though he found himself struggling to picture those places anymore. "You've been everywhere," Ember said one night, sitting cross-legged by the hearth as she shaped another small wooden figure. "Everywhere worth going," Silas said with a wry smile. "Do you miss it?" Silas considered the question. "I thought I would, but no, not anymore." The sheriff returned once in early April, this time without his deputies. He stayed for coffee, told Silas that word of Beaumont Crow's death had traveled far and wide. "Folk think you're some kind of hero now," the sheriff said with a faint grin. Silas shook his head. "I'm not." The sheriff looked at Ember, then who was perched on the porch rail, a small knife in hand, as she carefully carved at a stick. "Maybe not, but you saved her. That counts for more than most men ever do." Before leaving, the sheriff left behind a sack of seeds, a handful of nails, and a promise that Ember had nothing to fear in this valley. Ember grew bolder with every passing week. She asked Silas to teach her how to read the words in the old book stacked on the shelf. She started drawing in the dirt with a stick, copying the letters he showed her. "Your name," Silas said, pointing at the shapes she'd scratched into the ground. "Ember," she whispered, tracing the letters with her finger. "Don't forget it. I won't." But even as the days stretched into something like peace, the shadow of the past never fully left. There were moments when Ember froze at sudden noises, her hand instinctively reaching for Silas's coat. There were nights when she woke, gasping, her voice trapped in her throat, eyes wide with terror. Each time, Silas sat with her, steady and patient, until her breathing calmed and her voice returned. "You're safe," he told her every time. "You're safe here." And each time she believed him a little more. By late spring, the garden sprouted tiny shoots of green. Ember beamed with pride as she watered them with careful hands. She had never planted anything before, never seen something grow because of her. "This is ours," she said one evening, her voice quiet but certain. "Ours," Silas agreed. The day she laughed without hesitation for the first time, Silas felt something inside him shift. She was chasing a rabbit through the clearing, hair flying loose behind her bare feet, kicking up clumps of earth. When she finally gave up, collapsing in the grass with giggles spilling from her chest, Silas just stood there, staring, stunned by the sound. It was a sound he never thought he'd hear from her. One evening in late May, Ember sat whittling on the porch, her hands steady as she shaped another figure. When she finished, she held it out to Alasa. Small carving of a cabin, rough but unmistakable. "For you," she said. Silas took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "Why a cabin?" "As because it's where you found me," Ember said. "Where I found me again." He didn't answer, just placed the carving on the windowsill, where the light of the setting sun struck it just right. The world beyond the forest hadn't forgotten Beaumont Crow or his crimes. Travelers passed through, sometimes straighters, drifters, lawmen. They told stories of towns rebuilding, of children returned to families who thought them lost forever. Ember listened in silence, her small hands curling into fists, but her eyes stayed steady. One night as the fire crackled low, Silas asked quietly, "When you're ready, do you want to see the world beyond this?" Ember looked at him for a long time, then shook her head. "Not yet. I want to stay. I'm not finished being here." Silas nodded. "Then we stay." Summer came, and with it, life. The garden bloomed. Fish returned to the streams, and the air no longer carried the bite of cold. Ember spent her days learning everything she could: how to read, how to carve, how to make the cabin truly hers. Some nights as the fire burned low and the forest sang outside, Silas realized the truth. This shack he had bought for a single dollar had become more than just shelter. It was a home. And the girl who had once been silent for 3 long years now laughed, spoke, and carved her name into the world around her. Silas had found Ember in the shadows of her own life, voiceless and forgotten. But now as the summer sun sank low behind the pines and her laughter echoed through the clearing, he knew that no one, or not the men who had taken her, not the ghosts of her past, would ever silence her again. And for the first time in a long, long time, Silas Grant felt something like hope take root inside him, steady, quiet, and strong, just like the girl who had brought it back to him. Summer settled over the valley like a long-forgotten promise. The snowmelt fed the river until it ran full and loud, and the forest erupted with color green so deep they almost hurt the eyes. Wildflowers scattering across the meadow as if someone had spilled paint on the earth. The cabin no longer felt like a place Silas had merely survived in. It had become something entirely different. Every morning began the same. Ember waking first, slipping out to feed the chickens that Silas had bartered for from a passing trader. She was careful with them, gentle in a way that spoke of someone who knew what it meant to be broken and patched back together again. Silas would follow after, often finding her crouched in the dirt, whispering to the hens as though they understood every word. "You talk to them," he teased one morning, leaning against the doorframe. "They listen," she replied with a shrug. "Sometimes that's enough. They planted more than just vegetables." With the seeds the sheriff had left, Ember insisted they try sunflowers. By midsummer, the plants had grown taller than she was. She stood in front of them one afternoon, her face tilted up toward the wide golden blooms. "They look free," she said softly. "They are," Silas replied. She turned to him, a faint smile touching her lips. "So am I." As the weeks rolled on, Silas noticed how Ember moved differently. She no longer flinched at sudden noises. Her laughter came easily, now bubbling up like something that had been waiting years to be let out. She read aloud from the books in the cabin, her voice gaining confidence with each passing day. And the wind carried their voices over the hills, she recited one evening, reading from a tattered novel as Silas mended a fence rail nearby. "You're getting good at that," Silas said without looking up. She smiled proudly. "I like knowing the words. It feels like I'm taking something back." Travelers came through from time to time, traders, drifters, and once even a preacher passing west. Ember no longer hid when they approached. She stood beside Silas, chin up, meeting their eyes without fear. Some of them recognized Beaumont Crow's name and muttered darkly about him. A few told stories of other children who had been returned to families far away. Each time Ember listened in silence, her expression unreadable until the travelers left and the valley returned to quiet. One night as the fire burned low, Silas finally asked, "Do you want to go find them? The ones you knew before all this?" Ember stared into the flames for a long moment before shaking her head. "They're gone," she said softly. "And I'm not her anymore. I'm me now. Here." Silas nodded, understanding in a way he hadn't expected to. By late summer, the shack bore little resemblance to the abandoned hovel Silas had bought for a single dollar. He had built a new roof with Ember's help, patched the walls with fresh timber, and even carved new shutters for the windows. On the inside, Ember's carvings lined the shelves, birds, animals, even a crude likeness of the cabin itself. One evening, she set down a new piece in front of Silas. Two small figures side by side, one tall, one short. "That's us," she said, her eyes shining. Silas ran a hand over the carving, the grooves rough under his callous fingers. It's perfect. The sheriff returned again in late August, this time bringing news. Beaumont Crow's name had finally been cleared from the land he once terrorized. Families were healing. Children were safe. You did more than you know, the sheriff said, sipping from a tin cup of Silas's bitter coffee. Silas only shrugged. I just did what needed doing. Before leaving, the sheriff pressed a folded piece of paper into Ember's hand. It was a letter of thank you from one of the families she had once known, written in shaky handwriting. Ember read it silently that night, her eyes wet but her shoulders straight. Autumn crept in slowly, the air sharpening the trees, shifting to gold and crimson. Silas and Ember harvested what they could from the garden, storing it away for the winter they knew would come again. One crisp morning, Ember came to him, holding a notebook she had borrowed from a traveler. Will you teach me to write? She asked. Silas nodded. I will. Had They spent evenings hunched over the table. Ember's tongue caught between her teeth as she carefully copied letters, her hand cramping but refusing to stop. She began to write her name over and over, the letters crooked but proud. By the time the first frost returned, Ember was not the same girl Silas had found in that shack. She had grown stronger, not just in her hands or her voice, but in the way she carried herself, the way she faced the world without shrinking back. Silas had changed too. The man who had once wanted to disappear had found himself instead, woven into someone else's life, bound by a purpose he hadn't known he still needed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the forest in gold, Ember stood in the doorway, watching the world bathe in the last light of day. You know what I think? She said quietly. What's that? Silas asked, setting aside the axe he'd been sharpening. That $1, she said, turning to him with a small smile. Might have been the best thing you ever spent. Silas felt the truth of it deep in his chest. Yeah, he said softly. It was the shack in the woods was no longer just a shack. It was there, a place where silence had been broken, where hope had taken root, where two lives had been rebuilt from the ground up. And as the first leaves of autumn drifted down around them, Ember's laughter echoed through the clearing, steady and sure, a sound no one would ever take from her again.